People on the left take up moral positions. They're moral. They're moralizing. They're trying to engage in a politics of conscience. But what really cripples them, I think, is the superego. They're often ashamed of their aggression, embarrassed and ashamed at their aggression. I think they tend to suppress it. Then it gets projected outwards, and it gets taken over by the superego. Their aggression, their inhibited aggression, gets taken over by the superego and turned against them. And so now here we are, engaged in the politics of love with all of the right values, conscientious, moral, but we're loaded with a superego, which makes it difficult for us to deploy our aggression outwards against the enemy, and instead turns it on ourselves. And so we become inhibited. We don't strike at the moment when it is necessary to strike. We don't know how to fight when it's necessary to fight. Those who identify with the overdog often have little trouble being vicious. I'm thinking of McConnell, Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell. Contrast that personality. It's an ugly personality. Contrast that to Bernie. I would take Bernie any day, but McConnell has no inhibition in fighting hard and fighting dirty for what he wants, and he therefore wins a lot of the time. Democrats in the U.S. just seem to cave. Now, of course, part of the reason they're caving is that they're being paid off by the same donors who are paying the Republicans. I'm not naive. I'm not overlooking the role of sheer corruption in all of this. But I don't think Bernie's corrupt. But I think he probably suffers from an inhibition. It took me many years in my own analysis to overcome my own inhibitions. Certainly as a graduate student, I had a writer's block. I had great trouble writing and finishing my PhD, and with the help of analysis, it became pretty clear that I was under the irrational fantasy that becoming Dr. Carveth was somehow killing my father. He was a family physician. He was Dr. Carveth. How dare I become Dr. Carveth? The day I got my PhD, he and my mother took me out to a wonderful restaurant to celebrate and gave me a wonderful gift and wrote a wonderful card, and I'm sitting there thinking I've just planted a knife in my father's back. Now, of course, that was crazy. He was proud as punch. But in my mind, this was some kind of Oedipal victory. I was bumping the old man off the log. That's a neurotic fantasy of Oedipal triumph. And it had delayed my obtaining of the degree. It had very much delayed the writing of the dissertation. Finally, I overcame the inhibitions and I did it. Now, of course, the inhibition wasn't forever conquered. It went on and expressed itself in a lot of other ways, but as time has gone on, I've pretty well defeated that inhibition. But I know many men who, to my dismay, throw in the towel at the last minute, clutch defeat from the jaws of victory. They give up right at the moment when, with another push, they could have won. So people who identify with the overdog seem to be able to be killers people who identify with the underdog seem to cave. Now, this is not always the case. I think it's in a recent interview with Chomsky that he mentions that to really succeed in these struggles, we often have to have a leader who is capable of what he called, I think, the sublime madness. Sublime madness. This is a leader who's really willing to go the whole way. A leader like Jesus Christ, who's willing to be crucified. Or a leader like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, despite a lifetime of Christian pacifism, decides that Hitler has to be killed and joins the plot to assassinate him. Unfortunately, they miss, and a few years later, Bonhoeffer is hung by the Gestapo. The sublime madness of those who are willing to sacrifice their personal lives and personal comfort out of loyalty to a cause. They're willing to go the distance. I'm thinking now of poor Julian Assange in prison in Britain awaiting extradition to America, where they may well kill him, torture him, for being a journalist. And where are all of the other journalists? Are they talking about this? You rarely hear a word about the crucifixion of this courageous journalist. Edward Snowden is living in Russia. So these are exceptions. These are men and women who are able to muster the sublime madness of going the distance, delivering the coup de grace to the opponent so that one can actually take over. Sometimes those who identify with the overdog, it's as if they know something about this superego inhibition in their opponents. They know how to draw themselves up into the authoritarian parent image and to speak down to those who they regard as impertinent enough to challenge their God-given authority. They seem to assume that they have the right to rule, and that anyone who would challenge their rule is somehow not only wrong, but impertinent, and they know how to sternly look at their challengers and wag their fingers at them as if they were naughty children who should know better than to challenge the parental authority. And because we have an internalized superego, that behavior sometimes evokes it, and it's as if the challenger is suddenly haunted by an internal parental voice. And now the challenger feels like a naughty little boy. He loses his sense of himself as an adult. And sometimes he caves. The capacity of the overdogs to cloak themselves in righteous authority and to assume that anyone that would challenge their right to rule is somehow wrong or bad or delinquent, and they know it. Psychologically, that turns out to be a pretty effective tool in evoking the inhibition in the opposition.